So today is the first day of our Rohatsu session, commemorating the enlightenment of the Buddha. Excuse me. So I thought it'd be appropriate to once again tell the story of the Buddha's journey to inspire us. we end our session on the 8th of December, which is what Rohatsu literally means, 8th of December. Excuse me, got So we all know the story of how Shakyamuni Buddha was born a prince and then left the palace when he was made aware of all the suffering in the world. And he embarked on a journey to understand the source of suffering and how to put an end to it. And we all know that he followed ascetic practices for 6 years before he took nourishment and sat for a week under the Bodhi tree in Magadha. He spent a week with his internal conflicts in the guise of Mara, the fiend, who tried to disrupt his meditation with firestorms, seductive women, and doubts about who would witness his enlightenment. And the Buddha was able to hold his mind steady, and on the 7th morning, he was enlightened when he saw the morning star, the planet Venus. And after he was enlightened, the Buddha pondered whether anyone could understand what he experienced, and he almost decided not to teach. So Siddhartha Gautama, as his birth name was born around 567 before the Christian era in a small kingdom just below the Himalayan foothills. And his father was a chief of the Shakya clan. And it's said that 12 years before his birth, the Brahmins prophesied that he would become either a universal monarch or a great sage. And to prevent him from becoming an ascetic, his father kept him within the confines of the palace, and he grew up in princely luxury, shielded from the outside world. And he was entertained by dancing girls, instructed by Brahmins, trained in archery, swordsmanship, wrestling, swimming, and running. And when he became of age, he married Gopa, who gave birth to a son. And he had, as we might say today, everything. Yet it wasn't enough. Something as persistent as his own shadow drew him beyond the castle walls. There in the streets of Kapilavastu, he encountered 3 simple things: a sick man, an old man, and a corpse being carried to the charnel grounds. And nothing in his life of ease had prepared him for this experience. And when his charioteer told him that all beings are subject to sickness, old age, and death, he could not rest. And he returned to the palace he passed a wandering ascetic walking peacefully along the road, wearing a robe and carrying this single bowl of a sadhu. And he resolved to leave the palace in search of the answer to the problem of suffering. Isn't that what all of us relate to at a certain level? What brought us to practice was some uneasiness about our life, whether we defined it so clearly as the Buddha did. But when it becomes clear to us that that's what our intention is, to resolve this great matter of sickness, old age, and death, then, we put ourselves wholeheartedly into it. Because, as the marquee on the movie theater says, coming soon, sickness, old age, and death. And even though some of us are older than others, it's not necessarily going to come any sooner for the older ones than the younger ones. So the Buddha, he bade his wife and child a silent farewell without waking them, and rode to the edge of the forest, where he cut his long hair with a sword, exchanged his fine clothes for the simple robes of an ascetic. And with these actions, Siddhartha Gautama joined a whole class of people who had dropped out of Indian society to find liberation. There's a variety of methods and teachings that Gautama investigated. In the deep forests and the teeming marketplace were alive the thousands of arguments and opinions. And in a way, it was a time not unlike our own. And he finally settled down with two teachers. From Arada Kalama, who had 300 disciples, he learned how to discipline his mind to enter the sphere of nothingness. But even though Arada Kalama asked him to remain and teach as an equal, he recognized that this was not liberation, and he left. Next, he learned how to enter the concentration of mind, which is neither consciousness nor unconsciousness, from Udraka Ramaputra. But neither was this liberation, and Siddhartha also left this teacher. After leaving his second teacher, Prince Siddhartha was known as ascetic Gautama, and he met 5 friends, fellow ascetics, who had also left the palace and a life of luxury. And they went to Uruvela, and for 6 years Gautama struggled and tortured his body while his 5 friends supported and looked after him. I will carry austerity to the utmost, thought Gautama. This is a way to acquire wisdom. So he practiced fasting, which was thought to be one of the best ways to acquire wisdom. And he lived on a grain of rice a day, and later nothing at all. His body became so thin that his legs were like bamboo sticks, and his backbone was like a rope, and his chest was like an incomplete roof. of a house, and his eyes sunk right inside like stones in a deep well. And his skin lost its golden color and became black. In fact, he looked like a living skeleton. All bones without any flesh. And he suffered terrible pain and hunger, and yet he continued to meditate. Maybe you've seen some statues of this austere Buddha showing his ribs, and you can see his backbone through his stomach. But he found even another way of torturing his body was to hold his breath for a long time until he felt violent pains in his ears, head, and whole body. And he would then fall senseless to the ground. And during the full moon and the new moon, he would go into the forest or to a cemetery to meditate, wearing rags from graveyards and rubbish heaps. He became frightened at first, especially when wild animals came, but he never ran away. He stayed behind bravely in these dreadful places, meditating all the time. For 6 long years he did these practices. And in spite of the great pain and suffering, he did not find wisdom or the answer to his questions. So he started to reflect on what he was doing. And he thought, why should I fear the happy state? That is without sensual desires and without evil ideas. And I thought, I do not fear that happy state, which is without sensual desires and without evil ideas. In other words, the state where there is no attachment to pleasure and no repulsion from pain, where there's no good and no bad. And thinking that to himself, he decided that he would take some nourishment. And if he just kept depriving his body the way he was, eventually he'd just kill himself. What came to him is that this body, which he was denying, is a very ancient agent of his own liberation. Many times my teacher, Maizumi Roshi, told us to appreciate ourselves. What we're appreciating is our own vehicle, our own agent, our own means for realizing our awakened state. And for those 6 years, the Buddha was denying his body. And finally, he concluded that these austerities are not the way to enlightenment. He went begging through the village for food to build up his body. And when his 5 friends saw this, they became disappointed. They took their bowl and robes and left, wanting nothing more to do with Gautama. In the village, a woman named Sujata offered him a dish of milk and a separate vessel of honey. And eventually his strength returned, and he washed himself in the Nairanjana River and then set off to the Bodhi tree. And he spread a mat of grass underneath the tree, crossed his legs, and sat. And according to the sutras, he said, though my skin, my nerves, and my bones should waste away, and my lifeblood should dry up, I will not leave this seat until I have attained supreme enlightenment. Sounds to me like he hasn't left his ascetic ways behind him. He's still willing to deprive himself. But he felt that he was nourished and that would give him the strength to attain it. So with that vow and that aspiration and with that determination, he sat down under the Bodhi tree to practice Zazen. And of course, everything he had done up to that point prepared him for the Zazen, which was to take place for 1 week. Although it's not of the same caliber, when I went to my first 7-day session, I told myself that I wasn't going to wiggle, squirm, move for the entire 7 days of Zazen. I'd done 5-day sessions before that, and I was squiggled and wiggled with the best of them. But I told myself I wasn't going to do it. And I stuck to it. Maybe some of you read my memoir, recall me talking about that. It was with the New York Zen Study Society with Edo Shimano Roshi, and there were probably about 50 people at this session, and I was sitting between a man and a woman, and I told the man after the session, I thanked him for sitting next to me. I saw him in the dorms, and he said, "Boy, was I pissed at you." And I said, "Really, why?" And he said, "You were breathing so hard, it was really bothering my concentration, and I started calling you Froggy." And I said, "Oh, really? I'm so sorry." And he says, "Okay, I got used to it." I thought I'd better go apologize to the women in case I bothered her Zazen. And I went and told her, "I'm sorry if my loud breathing bothered you." And she says, "What?" She said, "You sat like the Rock of Gibraltar." Didn't even move once. And then I realized that it had nothing to do with me. She was a Rock of Gibraltar, and that other guy was Froggy. And I was going to introduce him and say, "Rock of Gibraltar, this is Froggy. Froggy, I'd like you to meet Rock of Gibraltar." Yeah, I know people who, in session, especially, when there's a lot of people and there's a new person coming in that you might be attracted to. In a 7-day session, you can fantasize about meeting that person, falling in love, getting married, having kids, and living happily ever after before the 7 days are up. We can project all kinds of things. But the Buddha, had all kinds of thoughts coming up too. But he was determined to quiet his mind. But like the rest of us, he had visitations, images. And there's a sutra that says that in order to distract him from his goal, Mara, the fiend, arrived on the scene. And Mara is the god of the underworld. And he came to distract the Buddha. So the first thing he did was assume the form of a messenger with disoriented garments, panting in haste, bearing a note from the Shakya princess, which is the house from which the Buddha was a member. And in the letter it was written that Devadatta had usurped the kingdom of Kapilavastu and had entered the Bodhisattva's palace, taking his goods and his wife, and had cast his father into prison. And all of the princes were praying that the Buddha would return and restore peace and order. Because his wife and child were in prison, and the whole kingdom was in disarray. So reflecting on this and what caused Devadatta to wreak havoc in his kingdom, and his malice that made him imprison some of the members of the clan, and that the princes were neutralized by cowardice and had failed to defend the king. And reflecting on the folly and weakness of the natural heart, it further strengthened the Buddha's resolve to attain a higher and better state of enlightenment. So then Mara fell back and regrouped. So deciding he couldn't trick him by subtle means, he was going to come on with the heavy artillery. So he created terrible whirlwinds and storms of rain and a mighty flood, and he cast down showers of rocks and a storm of deadly and poisonous weapons and burning ashes. But according to the sutra, none of them fell on the Buddha's head as he sat. But these, correspond to the tremendous Makyu experiences that maybe some of you have had. Particularly if you're sitting facing a wall that's textured or a carpet that's textured, you can see all kinds of amazing things going on. Yeah. And maybe sometimes your whole body has disappeared and you felt like you were floating in space. And there are some statues of the Buddha, with a big cobra behind him with its hood spread over the top of the Buddha's head, which supposedly protected him from all of the projectiles that were falling out of the sky. Yeah, but he didn't relent from his meditation. So, having failed by subtle means and by overt means, Mara decided that he would definitely get the Buddha if he turned to sex. So he brought his 3 beautiful daughters to seduce the Buddha away from his meditation. And they danced before the Buddha while he was doing zazen. And they were young and alive and beautiful. And they used every talent of seduction that's known to beautiful women. They offered him everything, paradise. They sang to him about springtime. And they exhibited supernatural beauty and grace. But it said the Buddha's heart was not moved in that direction. And he answered them saying, "Such pleasure is as brief as a flash of lightning." And because they could not shake his calm, the young daughters of Mara stopped their flirting, and they decided they would join him in zazen. And they practiced it. So at this point, Mara had tried everything in his arsenal, and he had felt defeated, but he had one more attempt when he said to the Buddha, challenging him, "How can you say with no witness to your enlightenment that you are to be enlightened?" And the Buddha touched the earth with one hand and calmly said, "The earth is my witness." And there's also statues of the Buddha, touching the earth, saying, "The earth is my witness." So as you know, after the morning, when the Buddha saw the morning star in the east, he was to have said that I and all beings and the great earth have simultaneously attained enlightenment. His very life is witnessed to his awakening. But even realizing that, the Buddha's practice was not over. He lived for 49 more years teaching. continually being with others and helping them with their practice. So it wasn't only the Buddha who had to struggle with his practice, but all of the patriarchs and Zen masters, the same thing. All of our ancestors. We become so conditioned to our ways of behaving and thinking. We have to take care of it one way or another. So, what the Buddha learned in those 6 years of struggle is how to practice Zazen. And then sitting down under the tree, he would sit and his mind was steady and calm. Being distracted by horrible visions, by beautiful visions. Whatever came up went right into his Zazen. When Dogen was a young monk, he supposedly said, if from the very beginning we are all Buddhas, why do we have to struggle so hard to realize it? And that was his life koan. And I think, I don't remember reading that Dogen came up with a definitive answer, but he kept saying to turn the light around inside. Keep looking inside. But Hakuin said that it's our habit-ridden consciousness that keeps us from realizing it. That's all of the beliefs, all of the unconscious conditioning, and all of our ways of impulsively behaving that have conditioned us. That our practice, we have to non-judgmentally look at that and allow it to gradually dissolve. So, wonder of wonders, the Buddha is reported to have said, this very enlightenment is the nature of all beings, yet they are unhappy for lack of it. So, it said after his enlightenment, his wife and son joined his order, and his stepmother became the head of an order of nuns. So for 7 weeks he enjoyed the freedom and tranquility of liberation. At first he had no inclination to speak about his realization, which he felt would be too difficult for most people to understand. But when, according to legend, a Brahma chief of the 3,000 worlds requested that the awakened one teach, since there were those whose eyes were only a little clouded over, the Buddha agreed. His 2 former teachers had both died, and so he sought the 5 ascetics who had left him. And when they saw him approaching in the deer park in Benares, they decided to ignore him, since he had broken his vows of asceticism. Yet they found something so radiant about his presence that they rose, prepared a seat, bathed his feet, and listened to the Buddha turn the wheel of the Dharma, the teachings, for the first time. The first noble truth of the Buddha states that all life, all existence is characterized by dukkha, a Sanskrit word meaning suffering or pain, unsatisfactoriness. Even moments of happiness have a way of turning into pain when we hold on to them, or once they have passed into memory. They twist the present as the mind makes an inevitable, hopeless attempt to recreate the past. So the teaching of the Buddha is based on direct insight into the nature of existence and is a radical critique of wishful thinking and the myriad tactics of escapism, whether through political utopianism, psychological obsession, simple hedonism, or the theistic salvation of mysticism. So dukkha, suffering, is a foundation, a stepping stone to be comprehended fully, not to be escaped from or explained. So sooner or later, no matter how comfortable you feel, no matter how much we have been protected from material want, life provides us with the opportunity to experience dukkha through loss, suffering, anguish, and the pain of anxiety over our destiny and that of our loved ones. So the experience of dukkha leads to the second noble truth, the origin of suffering. And it's traditionally described as craving, thirsting for pleasure, but also for more fundamentally a thirst for continued existence, as well as in some cases a continual non-existence. Examination of the nature of this thirst leads to the heart of the second noble truth. The idea of the self, or I, with all its desires, hopes, and fears. And it's only when this self is comprehended and seen to be insubstantial that the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, is realized. So the five ascetics who listened to the Buddha's first discourse in the deer park became the nucleus of a community, a sangha of men. Women were allowed to enter later. A sangha who followed the way of the Buddha. And he described the fourth noble truth, the eightfold path, is how to eliminate suffering, including, right view, right practice, right livelihood, right thought. And they traveled around northeastern India practicing meditation and begging for their meals. So the Buddha's teachings was not only for the monastic community. Shakyamuni had instructed them to bring it to all for the gain of the many, the welfare of the many, and compassion for the world, for the good, for the gain of the welfare of men and women. So for the next 49 years, Shakyamuni walked through the villages and towns of India, speaking in the vernacular, using common figures of speech that everyone could understand. He taught a villager to practice mindfulness while drawing water from a well. And when a distraught mother asked him to heal the dead child she carried in her arms, He did not perform a miracle, but instead instructed her to bring him a mustard seed from a house where no one had ever died. She returned from her search without the seed, but with the knowledge that death is universal. As the Buddha's fame spread, kings and other wealthy patrons donated parks and gardens for retreats. And the Buddha accepted these, but he continued to live as he had ever since his 29th year, as a wandering sadhu, begging his own meals, spending his days in meditation. Only now there was one difference. Almost every day after his noon meal, the Buddha taught. And none of these discourses, or the question and answer that followed, were recorded during the Buddha's lifetime. The Buddha died in the town of Kushinagara at the age of 80, having eaten a meal of pork or mushrooms, and some of the assembled monks were despondent. But the Buddha, lying on his side with his head resting in his right hand, reminded them that everything is impermanent and advised them to take refuge in themselves and the Dharma. He asked for questions the last time, and there were none. Then he spoke his final words. Now then, monks, I address you. All compound things are subject to decay. Strive diligently. Like the Ino chant at the end of the day, the evening Gatha, do not waste your time by night or day. Take heed. So the first rainy season after the Buddha's parinirvana, it said that 500 elders gathered at a mountain cave where they held the first council. And Ananda, who had been the Buddha's attendant, reported all the discourses or sutras he had heard. And Upali recited the 250 monastic rules, which are the Vinaya, and Mahakashapa recited the Abhidharma, the compendium of Buddhist psychology and metaphysics. And these three collections, the sutras, the Vinaya, and the Abhidharma, were written on palm leaves a few centuries later, and they're known as a Tripitaka, which literally means three baskets. And they became the basis for all subsequent versions of Buddhist canon. So the basic choice between the spiritual life and the worldly confronts us all. Teachers often exhort us to abandon our attachments and persist in the choice to strive for awakening. Every day we make choices that determine the future path of our lives. We face this choice again and again in the course of our everyday activities. In the case of the Buddha, it seemed so simple and straightforward. He begged for food and slept under the stars. How about us in the age of cell phones, the internet, and instant communication? Can we have both enlightenment and the good life? Goethe said, the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would otherwise have not occurred. A whole stream of events. issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and assistance, which no person could have dreamed would have come his way or her way or their way. So there's no substitute for really committing ourselves to the practice, committing ourselves to Shishin. If you're always going to wait for the right moment, that moment never comes. That moment is right now. So renew your vows, renew your intention. Enter Zen from right here, right in this Zen center. And after 2,500 years of continuous practice, Shakyamuni Buddha is still sitting right here and right now. That's all said, as Shakyamuni Buddha said, I and all beings everywhere in the great earth are simultaneously awakened. I and Shakyamuni Buddha are simultaneously doing Zazen. So even though our session is a bit abbreviated, and maybe because it's a bit abbreviated, we shouldn't waste our time by night or day. Take advantage of this precious time, this precious moment, one breath after one breath. Yeah.